Hi, everyone. You're listening to Backstory. Let's hear it on WTBR-FM, Pittsfield, with Roberta McCulloch-Dews off the mayor's office in the city of Pittsfield. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have with us Pittsfield Police Chief Michael Wynn. You've been a police officer for approximately 27 years.
Just about that, yeah.
All right. So I'm gonna welcome you because there's a lot to Chief Michael Wynn. So I just want to give a little some background for people who may not know. So during your tenure, you've worked in a variety of roles, including patrol, training, SWAT, and internal affairs. You've also served as a subject matter instructor and drill instructor in various police academies. So you keep busy. And you are actually currently pursuing your second master's degree, which I'll get into a little bit later. But you've also found time to be a published author, and you give of your time to support the community in so many ways. And you have a weekly radio show, On Patrol with PPD, here on WTBR.
Full credit, the department has a weekly radio show.
Oh, absolutely, of course.
The team does all the heavy lifting for that. I just have to show up.
Shout out to Gary Traversa.
Absolutely.
All right. All right, so needless to say, you're very busy. So welcome, Chief. Let's get started.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for making the time. With all of my guests, I want people to see them as the full individual. So I know that you are Chief Wynn, but I want to take it a little bit back to young Mike. And did you refer to yourself as young Mike or young Michael?
So excuse me, when I was a kid, my mom, generally referred to me as Michael. I'm named for my father, and I had family nickname. I won't get into that publicly. But I think particularly for young boys, there comes a point when you have to kind of self-identify. And when I kind of got out and started forming my own friend network, I changed the way I refer to myself as Mike, because that's how my father referred to himself.
Okay.
And so I'd say probably elementary school, middle school, I was Michael, and then after that I was Mike. Okay.
Tell me a little bit about your family and how life for you when you were growing up, because I believe you recently have a blog post that talks about just your experiences. You are of mixed heritage, your background, and so I know that can contribute into how individuals see the world. So what was it like for you?
So I am biracial, mixed heritage. When I was a kid, we we believed that my mother's family was 100% Polish. And now, having done some genealogy, that's probably not the case. We were raised Polish. My grandmother spoke Polish, but more likely than not, they probably were Georgian or Georgian Jewish. And so kind of exploring that a little bit. And my dad was African American, which, as you know, makes it difficult to actually kind of figure out what your lineage is. And my dad died when I was very young. I was 3 years old. On the day after my younger brother was born, he was killed in a car crash. So for a couple of years, we were back at my grandmother's farm when my mom was trying to figure that out. And then after 2.5, 3 years, she took the insurance money and bought a home here in Pittsfield, and that's the house I grew up in. So my mom, my younger brother, and I, and then after a few years, the man who eventually became my stepfather, my second father, he came into our life. He's a long-haul truck driver, and so he rented an office and some yard from my mom to keep the truck there, and then they became a couple.
Okay. So what was your block? What was your street that you grew up on?
Oh, so I grew up on the same street I live on now. I grew up in Cadwell Road on the west end of Pittsfield.
You didn't go too far.
So at some point after I was on the job for reasons that had to do with my grandmother's health, my mom moved back to the farm and left the house here in Pittsfield empty. And so we moved into the house to kind of caretake for it. And I was out for a run one day as that period was coming to a close, and I knew I was going to be looking for another place to live. I was out for a run one day, and I ran by the house that I now own. And I was like, I know all the running routes. I know where all the trails are. I have to learn a new neighborhood. So I bought a house 150 yards from the house I grew up in.
Did you feel a sense of nostalgia when you were on that block? Did you feel an emotional connection?
Honestly, the period when my ex-wife and I moved back into the house, it wasn't very nostalgic with everything that was going on with my grandmother and some issues with the deed to the property. It was a stressful year. And, we didn't really want to do it. We had an apartment that we really liked when my family approached me about caretaking the house. And it was just a year we had to get through.
Right. I want to go back a little bit to just your growing up as a child of a mixed background. What was that like for you at the time that you grew up? Because, we're talking like the late 70s, early 80s.
Early 70s.
Yeah, early 70s. So what was that like in this community?
So this was part of what I reflected on in that blog. And full credit to my mom. Like she was a young white woman raising two biracial children, and she'd been fairly active in I'm not going to say in the civil rights movement, but in pursuing equality. And so she wanted to do right by these young boys, but she didn't know how to do that. Right. She didn't have any lived experience, and we didn't have any close family close by. So my mom had met my father when they were in college. They started dating between BCC and at the time North Adams State College. She was pretty much disowned by her family as a result of that. It wasn't until I was born that there was any reconciliation with her family. Ironically, her younger sister kind of took a page from her book. She also married a black man. And so together, the two of them against the world. But right. My mom raised us, like I said, in the neighborhood I live in now, which is predominantly white. And my aunt her husband raised their children in the West Side.
Okay.
So I was well into elementary school before I even realized, that race was a thing.
Right.
And we studied, famous persons of color. My mom we were avid readers, and we had encyclopedias and books, and she always identified it, but didn't have any experience with it. And so going to visit my cousins over on Circular Ave and going down to, at the time, Pitt Park, now Durant Park, that was really the only exposure we had to people of color. I didn't have any students of color in my elementary school. You
went to Stearns,
I
right?
went to Stearns, yeah.
Wow. I can only imagine when you go into the West Side, because they probably saw people of different backgrounds because the West Side was a very mixed neighborhood.
Very mixed.
So how was the interactions between you and your cousins then? Did they have more, to be a little bit blunt, did they have feel like they were aware of their blackness a little bit more?
Oh, certainly. Okay. Yeah. And so I guess another ironic thing that my mom has 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. And so her older sister, Jeanette, had one child, my cousin Kelly, who we tragically lost a few years ago to breast cancer.
I'm sorry.
And so just because of the way it worked out, Kelly and I were the same age. We were only a couple months apart. My brother John and my cousin Brendan were the same age. They were only a month apart. And it worked out. All the couples had pairs. And so, I spent a lot more time with Kelly than I did with Brendan. And as a result, and they lived in a fairly homogenous neighborhood too. So my brother had more lived experience as a child with people of color than I did even. And so, again, it wasn't until I was well in elementary school that it even became a thing.
Yeah.
And it probably wasn't until I was in college that I actually had to confront it and figure out a way to deal with it.
So interesting. It's so interesting. And I think even more so that you had that gap until you got to college, that you were able to really go through your childhood, your adolescence, your teen years, really sort of in your having your own perspective of yourself and not necessarily having that challenged in a major way.
So one of the other things I wrote about in this blog post was that up until I was trying to figure out how I was going to get out of high school and process into the military, if I had to take a standardized test or fill out a demographic form, I always filled in the bubble for other.
You did.
And left it blank.
Before it was popular.
Yeah. And then I distinctly remember the day I was processing in for a Naval ROTC scholarship, and I was sitting in my officer selection officers space in Albany, and he looked at me and he said, "You're a very strong candidate. You're probably going to get an ROTC scholarship, but if you change this to black, you will get a scholarship today."
Did you?
I thought about it for a little while, and yeah, I did.
Okay.
It's like, it's a lot of money on the table.
Right. Oh boy. Okay, so I'm gonna keep you back on memory lane for a little bit, because there was a really great picture of you and your brother in the Berkshire Eagle. It was in the October 11th, 1980 edition.
How did you find that picture?
I do my research, and so you are scraping ice off the family car. Okay, yep. So was that the first time that you ever had been photographed by?
I'm pretty sure that was the first. Well, actually, no, it wasn't. Now that I think about it, so when I was a kid, one of the things my mom did, again, to try to expose us and broaden our horizons, is every summer for several years we had a fresh air child from the city. Nice. And Gerald would come and stay with us for the summer. And probably the first time I was ever photographed, at least for the media, was we were picking him up at the bus station.
Nice.
And I don't even know that I was identified in that photo. It was just kind of like a B-roll shot of the program. This is a long shot, but any connection still to Gerald? Do you know? No, we lost touch with him when I was in middle school.
Oh. I remember I was in New York City. I remember seeing commercials for the Fresh Air Fund and donate to that, and you would see these wide open green spaces that you'd leave. Crazy. You'd leave the urban environment and go to these spaces. It seemed fantastic.
It's I have many distinct memories, but I have one that it just boggled my mind. We couldn't convince him that milk came from cows. Like in his lived experience, milk came in a carton from the store. He couldn't make the conceptual leap back to the cow. And, the family owned a dairy farm, so we had to walk him through that.
Right. And so he has something to take back to his friends in the city. Like, I have something to share with you. Yeah, I think it goes back to your point of reference, like you said, your lived experience. And for him, if you've never seen a cow.
Right.
It's pretty radical. I think it's radical. All right. So one final question about that picture. When you think about it as an adult and you look at your young self and your brother, what comes to mind?
So that picture holds a special place in my heart. And, it's a great picture. I think it captured the moment of, these two young boys, just, doing what you got to do to get the day started. My mom was a school bus driver, so it was early. But the part that was the coolest for me about that picture is the photographer, the journalist, was Joel Labrizzi, who was an award-winning, I think he got a Pulitzer, Eagle photographer, Eagle photojournalist. Yeah. And Joel was still with the Eagle when I got into public service. So, he photographed me several times subsequently, and we always, he remembered that picture. I remembered him taking that picture. And it was just a cool connection to come back around to.
Full circle.
Yeah.
All right. So as a kid, you mentioned, trying to hightail it out of high school. So I want to go back to when you were thinking about future professions and your When I Grow Up list. Did you know that you wanted to be a police officer?
No, ironically, I absolutely did not want to be a police officer.
Okay, do tell.
So I wanted to go in the military from a very young age. I wanted to go in the military. And I was driving over here this morning. I had this memory, and my mom's going to be really angry. But at one point, I think I was in the 5th grade. I was a Boy Scout, and so I was reading Boys Life magazine. And at the time, in the back of Boys Life, they used to advertise for these private military schools. And I think I was in the 5th grade. I wrote to a bunch of those schools and got their catalogs and their applications. I was like, Mom, send me to one of these. I can't imagine what she was thinking, but I knew I wanted to be in the military. And so, junior year in high school, if you're thinking about that kind of track as an officer, you got to make some decisions. And so I applied for a Naval ROTC scholarship, and I applied to the Naval Academy, West Point, and the Coast Guard Academy. And I had the good fortune to get accepted to both Navy and Coast Guard. Yeah. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with both acceptance letters. This was the late 80s. It was the Miami Vice era. The war on drugs was exploding. Coast Guard was very, very active in interdiction in Florida. And I consciously said, I don't want to be a cop. I don't want to do law enforcement. And so I did not go to Coast Guard.
Why? I got to ask you why you said that.
Because so in my mind at the time, having grown up in the 80s, mid to late 80s, it was the height of the Cold War. And I thought I was going to go fight the Russian bear. I didn't want to do drug enforcement.
Yeah. You were thinking higher.
I don't know that it was higher. I mean, in hindsight, I think it probably was a more significant role.
Right.
And the Cold War fizzled and everything. I took Russian in college because I thought I was going to go stand in the Fulda Gap and stare down Ivan. So
I got to think about this. All right. So the passion for the military, I'm trying to figure out where did that come from? Because you obviously had this really, really deep connection to wanting to attach yourself to this. So where did that come from? Was it from the news? Was it?
So again, one of the things that my mom tried to do is to expose both of us to a variety of different experiences and a variety of different people. And one of the ways, I did that, as I said, was joining scouting.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate that in my Cub Scout den and then later in my Boy Scout troop, a lot of the scoutmasters were military. They had spent time in the military and they had gotten out and either come home or relocated here. A lot of them were General Electric or General Dynamics. And they identified at a very early age, I probably wasn't 10 or 11, that being the son of a single mother, maybe being the son of a single mother of mixed heritage, that there was some challenges there. So they really took me under their wings, pushed me into the sciences and introduced, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time over at General Electric and General Dynamics, meet officers from Navy Blue and Gold Association. So as a middle schooler, I was, I'm not going to say being prepared, but at least being having the door open, the military could provide me with some options. And so, I never considered anything else when I was in high school. I knew I wanted to go in the military.
Nice. Well, tell me the leap from the Naval Academy to Williams.
So I decided to go to Navy. My entire senior year knew I was going to Navy, was prepping to go to Navy, and I was a big science geek in high school. I took 2 years of college chemistry while I was still in high school, and I thought I was going to study chemistry. We were the Top Gun class, so I was going to fly jets. Of course, I was ignoring the fact that I was blind at the time, to Coke bottle glasses, and so I took all my AP exams in my senior year, and I get down to Navy and I'm going through plebe summer and training, and they call us in to King Hall, the Chow Hall one day to kind of receive the results of our exams. And I did okay on chemistry, but I maxed out on AP English and validated out of freshman English. I'm like, this is awesome. So I quickly changed my major from chemistry to English and moved into the humanities track. Right. And at the time in the late 80s, it didn't matter what your major was. Everybody from Navy was immersed in engineering classes. Even if you were an English major, you would be qualified to sit for your engineering boards when you graduated. And so I'm at Navy, going through plebe year. It's just a drag, studying all the time. And going to Navy was a humbling experience, right? We get there and like I said, I thought I was going to study chemistry and fly jets. And before plebe summer was over, I had changed my mind. I was going to study English and go in the Marine Corps because I wasn't getting anywhere near a cockpit with my vision.
Right.
And you go there and they tell you you're in the top 1/10 of 1% of your classmates academically in the country, and then you get there and you're at best average. Right. Everybody in the class, all 1,500 of you, were rock stars.
They're all stars,
and,
right?
And you gotta average that out, right?
Right.
And I was way below average compared to my classmates.
Right. So then, from that point, then, how was Williams your first choice, or
no? So the Naval Academy is supposed to be a 4-year program, and you graduate with your bachelor's degree and your commission.
Yeah.
And so I got through. I started challenging my decision during plebe year, but I made a conscious decision. I was not going to let that experience beat me. If I was going to reconsider something, I was going to at least finish that year.
Right.
Plus, my second class summer, my sophomore summer, I had some great stuff lined up, so I wasn't going to give up on that. So I went back as a sophomore, or as we would say, a youngster, and I started the academic year, and it was probably October of my third semester.
Okay.
And it was late at night. I was, several hours into my homework, and it was well past lights out, and I wasn't done yet. And I looked at what I was working on. I had spent hours working on engineering, and I hadn't gotten to my English assignments yet. And I can't do this. I can't do this anymore.
It's not sustainable.
So I went to class the next day, and I had a conversation with my English professor. And ironically, she was a part-time resident of Tyringham. Her husband was a professor at Williams. And she was like, if you're going to study English, you've got a world-class institution in your backyard. Go home.
Right.
And so I, can't do that. I can't quit here. And so she went home that weekend. And the following week, when I walked into class, she handed me a Ziploc bag full of Berkshire fall foliage leaves. And I resigned my appointment later that week. So it was the middle of my semester, so I couldn't go back to school until the following fall. So I took some classes at BCC and was fortunate enough that Williams accepted me, given my departure from Navy.
Right.
And I went to Williams as a sophomore after that gap year.
All right. And he studied English literature and American studies.
I did.
All right. So on that path, and, you go through... studying, these concentrations. At what point then did you think, all right, what am I going to do with myself? Am I going to think about my future, in relation to service or communities? Like, what was your thought at that point? Because obviously you had so many options.
So when I left Navy, because you have to resign. You can't just quit, right? I was in the military. I had signed this contract. I was walking away. I owed them a lot of money. You get paid when you're a midshipman at the Naval Academy, but they're docking your pay for all of your uniform and equipment, so I had a outstanding loan balance. And so when I went to Williams, when I left Navy, I had to agree that I would continue to pursue my commission. And so I left Navy, and shortly thereafter got accepted into the Marine Corps Platoon Leaders Course program and enlisted in the reserves to get ready to go. So I got to Williams as a Marine Corps reservist, planning on going back to training. And I did. So the summer after my sophomore year, the summer I turned 21, I went to Marine Corps Officer Candidate School Platoon Leaders Course in Quantico, Virginia. And I was about 4.5 weeks into my first rotation. And I got injured, but I didn't get injured there. We found out that it was an old injury. I sustained an injury in high school that I wasn't aware of. And at the time, it was peacetime Marine Corps. It was a career-ending injury. So they booted me out of the Marine Corps. I was 21 years old, and I had never wanted to do anything but be in the military.
So that must have been heartbreaking. And
I didn't know what to do. And so I was fortunate. I had a mentor. He had been my sailing coach at Navy. And I called him. I was like, they're going to kick me out of here. I don't know what I'm going to do. And he had retired from the military and started working with the Drug Enforcement Administration. And he was involved in a program. We can talk about it now. They didn't talk about it much back then. He was involved in a program called Operation Snowcap, where they were training DEA agents to go to South America to target drug production labs. They were doing covert counterinsurgency operations in the jungle, going after airstrips and cocaine processing factories. And he was the trainer for these agents who were going down there.
That's heavy stuff.
He took them into the field. So he's like, doing the same stuff you'd be doing in the Marine Corps, come work with us.
Right.
So for my last 2 years at Williams, that was the plan. Become a federal agent, go do stuff in the jungle. And when I graduated in 93, DEA wouldn't take you if you didn't have law enforcement experience. So I had to figure out a way to get some law enforcement experience.
Right.
So I always say this to kids. So I did what any recent college graduate would do when you don't have a job. I went home and tried to figure out how to get some law enforcement experience.
Okay. And that was your initial foray into...
First time I ever thought about being a local cop.
Okay. What was your relationship to local law enforcement? I mean, obviously, you're a part of this the network of brothers. But prior to that, growing up, what was your relation to? Did you just see police as an entity as afar, or? So
I think the only conception, other than a couple minor brushes, at some high school parties where they would chase us into the woods, kind of thing. The only conception I had of law enforcement at all, the only interaction I had was former Pittsfield police officer Ray Shagri, who was our safety officer. He was the one who came into school and did the pedestrian safety and the bicycle safety. Because my mom was a school bus driver, she knew him, and so I knew him as Officer Ray. I didn't know him well, but he was the Pittsfield Police Department, and former trooper Freddie Taliaferro, who inspected the school buses. So he would come and do like our bus evacuation drills and stuff. And so I knew Trooper Taliaferro. But that was it. I didn't know anything about local law enforcement. Okay.
So you joined the police department in 1995.
So I came home, didn't have a job, and actually I went away for the summer after I graduated. I worked at a Boy Scout camp on the waterfront doing aquatic stuff for the summer. Came back, didn't have a job, picked up a couple part-time jobs, and shortly after I got home, the city advertised for a position with the West Side Neighborhood Resource Center. Right. And the Resource Center was community policing funded program. The department was going to open an office in the West Side. They needed a civilian liaison to work with those patrol officers. And so I applied for that job. Just randomly, and was fortunate enough I got it. Right.
And you were the first ever director, right?
Yeah, they hadn't established the center yet. Yeah. So Reverend Durant, Reverend Pratt, Jim Williamson, a bunch of prominent West Side people. Reverend Durant's son was also a candidate for the job, and they selected me over him. Tyus and I worked together. He worked with us part time. So I took that job, met the officers who were assigned to that program, James Hunt, Dwayne Foisey, Tommy Barber. And at the time, one of the things the department was struggling with was how to recruit more people of color to take the civil service exam. We hadn't had an officer of color at that point hired. I don't remember if the last one was Officer Walter Powell or Officer Joel Maurer, but it had been years. And it was because nobody was taking the test. And so I was assigned to try to figure out a way to make the test more attractive. And so I was like, well, I'll take the test. Is there something about this test that's driving people away? And so I took the test and did very well. Excuse me.
That's okay.
And I was on the top of the list 2 years later when they started hiring.
When you took the test, did you notice anything, or you obviously you took it with fresh eyes? So were there anything, things that stood out to you when you took it that would make you see like this is maybe a barrier or whatever?
Well, in our professional capacity, you've been in the room when I've complained about civil service many times, and just in hindsight, looking at it, a couple obvious things like. First of all, you have to pay to take the test, right? So if you're socioeconomically challenged, that's going to be a problem. Secondly, the test is offered at the time, I was fortunate, I only had to go to Dalton, but civil service picks regional hubs to hold the test. So if you don't have your own car, that can be a challenge. Right. And then the other thing, and we're still dealing with this today, is if you're, working class and you're holding down a couple jobs, it's a day-long test, sometimes on a Saturday. Like if you work in the service industry, you probably have to take time off to go take that test.
And not get paid.
Yeah. And, to this day, there are still these barriers. It's one of the reasons, we try to work with interested candidates and, figure out ways to help them overcome some of those, including transportation. But the other thing is the test is just, first of all, it doesn't test anything that's appropriate for law enforcement. Yeah. It's kind of a general knowledge test. And I'm not going to say it was a difficult test, but it's written by academics. So
Wouldn't it make more sense to have people who are in the professions be at the table when things like that are put together?
You have to look back at the history of civil service and remember why it was created, right? It was created to overcome nepotism and get politics out of government hiring. And at the time, it served its purpose. But, with strong labor laws and strong unions, it's very redundant now. And it definitely minimizes the available candidate pool.
Right, we see that too for the city. So, well, in thinking about you're in this role and you're the director, right? And you're doing all this, you're building bridges, basically. You're building bridges. Trying to. And you do this work. When you think about your time back as a director and the bridges that were built then and your approach to community policing today, how has it influenced you?
So the first thing to remember when you talk about community policing is there's two components to it. It's community first and then policing. I get really frustrated when I hear from somebody, the department doesn't do enough community policing. You can't do community policing without the community.
Right.
And most of the stuff that we worked on when I was at the Westside Neighborhood Resource Center had nothing to do with the police department. We were in a problem-solving role. We were kind of in an ombudsman role. We had some significant controversies. I think one of the first things I had to confront is we had some drug-related violence on street-level violence on several streets, and the local taxi company basically just said, "We're not picking up fares in that neighborhood anymore." It was the only public transportation available. It wasn't tenable.
Right.
It wasn't legal.
Right.
And so we had to have these community-wide meetings and mediate that dispute. And we could understand the driver's concerns, but that wasn't the appropriate response.
Right.
We had to tell the community, you want this service, you deserve this service. You got to convince these young men to stop messing around, right?
Right.
You're going to have much more influence with them than we are. And we took that approach and take that approach to this day with a lot of our issues, particularly in our socioeconomically challenged neighborhoods. You got to set and agree on the standards and norms of acceptable conduct.
Right. It's the community, as you say, when you live in a community, that is your place.
Right.
And those are your neighbors, and it's saying, listen, we don't want that here.
Yep.
And we're not going to tolerate it, right? And so every neighborhood has that ability to have that agency in how it moves. But I think that there are so many factors that hinder people. There's fear. Especially if like the elements that are negative seem that they're stronger, then they feel like that agency has been diminished and they don't feel like they have a right to even say anything for fear of retaliation or whatever sometimes.
I mean, you've heard me say this in community meetings. Most, not all. I mean, we do have some out-of-town elements that, come here specifically to deal drugs, engage in stuff. But even when we have out-of-town organizations, at some point, a lot of the players, at least the street-level players, are local. They're recruited and they're here. And every time we have a violent incident, particularly a gun-related incident, that gun didn't magically materialize in that young person's hand at the time of the incident.
Right.
They left the house that day.
Right.
If they didn't have it on them, it was hidden somewhere nearby.
Right.
Somebody knew that young person had access to that gun.
Right.
Much better to tell us before the crime of violence happens than be telling us after the fact.
Absolutely. Everyone, no matter who you are, you have to lay your head down somewhere.
Right.
So it's not that, people just disappear into the caves. Right. There is a place where they go. So it really is about thinking about how do we preserve our livelihood, our quality of life for our children, making sure our seniors can walk the streets safe. Exactly. All of that matters. And we all really do have the power to think about how we are going to see our neighborhoods and what we allow in it, and then work alongside those agencies that can help us. I realize we have like 20 minutes left, and I have so many things in my head that I want to ask you. So I'm going to, I think I want to, the fact is that you really you ascended through the ranks, Chief, in an awesome way. I mean, once you joined the police force in 1995, your promotions, the multiple promotions followed, and then I want to say in which year was it? 2007, you were appointed the Acton Police Chief. That was the time when Chief Riello, he departed. And then 10 years later, you were finally installed as the permanent police chief. That
another long story.
That's a long story. Give me the Cliff Notes version.
So just to go back to the promotions. So again, when I joined the Pittsfield Police Department, I had no intention of being a local cop. I wanted to be a federal agent. And so I took the test at the request of Chief Lee to try to figure that out, got the job, got to the academy. And, so 1996, when I got out of the academy, the plan was still to become a federal agent.
Yeah.
And so I'm working and I'm going through several selection processes with the Border Patrol, Customs, DEA, and ultimately was a finalist for a position with DEA, and then at the very last minute wasn't selected for that job. And so I came back from the meeting with my DEA recruiter and just devastated, right? I don't know what I'm going to do now. And I met with my lieutenant at the time, and I was like, "Hey, boss, not for nothing. Everybody knew I was leaving. Right? Everybody knew it was a stepping stone job." And so I came back. I was like, "They're not taking me. I'm not going to be leaving." And so he closed the door and he said, "Look, we've had our eye on you." I knew these guys from when I was at the resource center. And he's like, "We've been holding off on providing you with any specialized training because we didn't want to invest in you if you were going to leave. But if you're going to stay and you tell me you're going to stay, we got a plan for you."
Yeah.
I was like, "Well, I'm not going anywhere now. What's the plan?" And I had done some training for the special response team when I was at the resource center. They knew that I had some instructor credentials and some other things. So that first year after I got turned down by the DEA, I spent 6 months of the year on the road going to instructor schools, because the idea was for me to take over the department's training unit and build a training capacity. So when I started that process in my head, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this training thing.
Yeah.
I'll start studying for promotional exam. And I was like, well, here's the thing. I'll do sergeant in 5, lieutenant in 10, captain in 15. And then by that time, Chief Riello, now Chief Lee had left, Chief Riello, he'll be trying to figure out what he's going to do. He's probably going to go to another agency. I'll go with him, right? So I made sergeant in 5.
Yeah.
I made lieutenant in like 8.
Yeah.
So I was a little ahead of the goal. I had done my my fellowship down in Quantico. And so I get early selected for captain in the summer of 2007.
Yeah.
But they can't make me a permanent captain yet because the incumbent captain, John O'Neill, wasn't scheduled to retire until like December.
You're captain in charge.
So not yet.
Captain in charge.
I was an acting captain, and I was just the admin captain. I went upstairs to go into admin.
Oh.
So I went into admin in July, and this was weird. So on November 1st, Chief Riello called me into his office, and he said, "I haven't been sharing this with anybody, been keeping it quiet. I've just accepted a job with another police department. I leave in 30 days.
That messed up your plan.
And so I was like, okay, what's that mean? He goes, well, we have to go across the street. I was like, why are we going across the street? He goes, because I've been talking to the mayor, and this job is yours if you want it.
Wow.
I'm like, excuse me? I was the junior captain.
Did you even envision that, Chief, could have been in your future? Because you even said in your plan that you were going to go with him.
Yeah. At some point, I thought I might be a police chief, but not here. So we go across the street. I have my first, lengthy meeting with Mayor Roberta.
Yeah.
And at the end of the meeting, he's like, can you do it? And I was like, I can. I'm not sure. I was the junior captain by a significant number of years. I was younger than all of the other captains. I had a breadth of experience, but not nearly the type of experience the other guys had. And so, Mayor Roberto said, okay, December 1st.
Did you feel imposter syndrome at that moment?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I still feel imposter syndrome sometimes. So I found out on November 1st, and I took command on December 1st.
Wow.
With no preparation.
That's a big jump.
Yeah.
Wow. But here you are.
Here I am.
What a story. Well, I mean, during your tenure, you've done so many things, but I really want to ask you, Chief, because you've seen so much, and what have been some of the pressing issues that have kept you up at night, and then what have been the solutions that you've been able to think about to meet them head on?
The pressing issues that keep me up at night. Staffing and recruiting, that's been a persistent challenge for the entire 14, 15 years I've been in that office. And we haven't made a lot of progress on that. We've had some really significant gains, and then something happens and we see some losses. We've had some high-level officer-involved shooting incidents, and after the investigations are done, all justified. But we are constantly doing an after-action process, an evaluative process, and at least one of those cases, had we had more or less lethal equipment at the time and more scenario-based training at the time, that probably could have had a different outcome. So we've added more equipment, push more decision-making to lower levels, try to really encourage our officers to make decisions in the moment instead of asking a supervisor to come talk them through it, because time matters in those cases. Right. And we've seen some really, really positive outcomes as a result of those changes. Decentralizing our decision-making. I meet with my commanders and tell them, if I picked you to be in one of these roles, that means I trust you to make the decisions about your unit. Tell me what you did. Don't ask me to do it. Right. So we're much more nimble and agile than we were at the time. Convincing people that investing resources, equipment resources, training resources, personnel resources up front is cheaper than dealing with the downstream ramifications if we send out poorly trained, poorly equipped people. That's hard. Right. In my first budget for Mayor Roberta, we don't get these now. We used to get every year, bring your budget in with a 5% reduction, a 10% reduction, and tell me what the impact is going to be on operations. And so doing the budget reduction and everything went down except for personnel and training. And he's like, well, if you have less personnel, you need less training. I was like, no, boss. If you're going to cut my people, I need to train the remaining people more. Absolutely. And that's been our philosophy ever since.
You have to have a balance. Oh, boy. Let's see. Looking back to 2020, we're dealing with the pandemic, but we're also dealing with so much social unrest. And the murder of George Floyd set in a wave of protests across the country. Here in Pittsfield, the rallies that took place were peaceful. I know I was a part of so many of them, and I would always see the Pittsfield Police Department there, just ensuring that it was a safe event. So there was always this collaborative element to it. You also participated in rallies during that time. Why was it important for you to be a part of those events?
As we said when we were talking about community policing, right? The police department works in partnership with the community. And if you're a resident of our city or a visitor to our city and you want to engage in protected activities, we're duty-bound and obligated to protect your right to do that. Now, we have to be mindful that if somebody decides to cross the line, if they're going to start to engage in something that encroaches on somebody else's rights, then we have to stop that. But up until and it can be loud and it can be insulting. I had at the Park Square rally, I had one woman confront me and get in my face. And to our community's credit, our local leaders, including Ms. E and Mr. Powell, came to my assistance, right? But that's because we spent so much time trying to establish those relationships. Now, if you take offense at something like the death of George Floyd, and we all should have, and you're angry and you want to see change, you have a right to protest. And we have an obligation to protect that right. If we're not engaged in the planning, then all we can do is respond reactively. And that means we have to come in with more. If we're engaged in the planning, then we can be proactive in our response, and that means we can take a much lower posture. Plus, you helped me edit a piece that I wrote in response to that. We had to look at that not just from the national discourse around changes to policing. I had to look at it as a defensive tactics instructor and a use of force evaluator and try to figure out how did this happen, because I needed to know what steps the department had to take to make sure that it couldn't happen here. Now, in hindsight, I was at a police advisory review board meeting following that, and PRB is like, what would you do if this happened here? And I thought for a second, I was like, well, I can't answer that because it wouldn't happen here. We had changed the training in Massachusetts so dramatically by that point that it would have taken a catastrophic failure of a series of systems for that to arrive. Now, we made some changes to make sure that catastrophic failure never occurs, but a Massachusetts police officer, a group of Massachusetts police officers wouldn't have engaged in that behavior, and if they had, somebody would have stopped it.
I wonder about, we have such great best practices here. Wouldn't it make sense for other states to look at other states that have best practices and say, how can we learn from them?
So, there's a lot going on nationally, and of course there's a lot going on in the Commonwealth that I've had the good fortune to be involved in. And I get this question from people a lot, and they don't understand, right? So the United States, we're going through this with several other national issues right now. The United States government is structured so that state rights are preeminent, and in most states in the nation, home rule is the rule of thumb. So there's, depending on who you ask, there's between 15,000 and 18,000 police agencies in the country, and every one of those agencies is under some degree of local control. So you can look at an organization like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which is a not-for-profit, it's not a governmental, and they can put out best practices and model policies and model training, but how that gets delivered to the small 5-officer police department in Arizona is completely up to the local elected officials and the police chief. And so if those best practices never get modeled and they never get trained, you don't see that type of nationwide. It doesn't percolate down, and that's one of the reasons I said in that piece that I wrote that at some point, even if I don't want to see federalized policing, that would be a disaster. But at some point, the Department of Justice has to promulgate guidelines or regulations that departments. We should all be taught use of force the same way. That shouldn't be in local control.
It makes sense. And it creates that peace of mind to know that, if I travel out of state, my family travels out of state, wherever, I can feel, that sense of safety and not feel like, they may encounter a situation where that same level of training and expertise is not.
Even before we got to the highly divided position that we're at as a nation now. And I'm a cop, and I travel extensively, both on and off the job. And a lot of times before I became the chief, if I was traveling for training, I would drive just to reduce the expense. Which meant I was driving in my personally owned vehicle with firearms in a lot of other states. I'm a cop. There are parts of this country I did not feel comfortable with driving with tactical equipment in my car. Right? I had to make a trip from D.C. to Raleigh, North Carolina, late at night. You get into some rural parts of the South, and not want to get pulled over.
Some people would say, sundown towns, but but yeah, absolutely. And I think the other level of it too, Chief, is that, as a man of color, that, you don't wear your chief hat that says chief on it. You know what I mean? So nobody knows.
Sometimes I do.
No one sees that. So it's like that in that split second judgment, seeing a car full of firearms. I mean, here you are, a decorated professional. You are a law enforcement professional. You are there to carry on your business. But in that moment, a snap judgment could be made.
I'll be honest, right? In hindsight, we're going back 20 years now. When I got ready to make that drive and I looked at the map and I realized where I was going to be driving, I called home and said, listen, if I get pulled over tonight, I'm not going to get arrested. I'm going to disappear. This vehicle full of weapons and I will just be gone. So
that is a sigh of exhaustion of that we even have to continue to think about those things, even in present day. But I think the counter to that is that you continue to stay in the fight and do good work. And last April, Governor Baker appointed you and 8 others from the Commonwealth to the Police Officer Standards and Training Commission. And I'm hoping maybe you can just provide a brief update on the work to date and how that's going to just benefit all of us here in the Commonwealth.
So I have to offer a brief correction. It's Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission.
Peace Officers. I stand corrected.
Because it applies not just to police officers, but troopers and sheriff's deputies. And we're recently finding out a whole bunch of other entities that I didn't know existed, like shellfish constables. Huh? Yeah, I had no idea either. It's been a lot of work. Yeah. It's been a lot of work. It was interesting trying to jump into the deep end and get to do the work with 8 fellow commissioners that I hadn't met before we got sworn in. Mm-hmm. When you put a team together, you got to go through the forming, storming, norming, performing. We didn't get a chance to do that. We literally met at the State House the day of the swearing in, had a brief meeting before we left, and then we're in Zoom meetings the next day trying to get the work done. Trial by fire. We've issued guidance on best practices for de-escalation and use of force with adolescents. We've issued regulations, formalizing the regulations of use of force. We're in the process right now of trying to unsort the regulations for certification, recertification, and decertification, and what the due process will look like on that. One of the things we realized is that there was some firm deadlines written into the statute, but the deadlines didn't correspond to the actual work that was being done. So, for example, December of last year, everybody who was on the job on December 1st was grandfathered in for a period of time. But if you weren't sworn in on December 1st, you had to meet the new requirements, which weren't written on December 1st. And we had 511 student officers in the academy that we had to figure something out for before they graduated. Wow. We'll finish the last batch of those 511 sometime near the end of February, and then focus on what we got to do for everybody who's currently serving. But that wasn't anticipated by the legislature, and so it was many emergency meetings and late notice meetings to try to get that done. Wow. You stay busy. Been a little busy.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So I just want to just make a note that I'm talking with Chief Wynn of the Pittsfield Police Department. He is the author of the book Rising Through the Ranks: Leadership Tools and Tactics in Law Enforcement. If you are interested, Chief, where can they go and pick up the book? Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon.
All right.
It was originally published by Kaplan, and they relinquished the rights back to me, so now it's self-published. Amazon's the easiest way to get it.
All right, cool. And you are currently pursuing a second master's degree. What led you to this decision?
I've been thinking about going back to school for a little while. I put it off because my wife was pursuing her doctorate, and the idea of two of us being in school at the same time wasn't going to work. I considered getting a MSW. I actually looked at a couple programs, and then I was out for a ruck march last year, and I was listening to a podcast, and I learned about this program that is a master's in psychology with a focus on military and emergency responder psychology.
There we go again with military again.
Well, given the work that we've been doing in the Commonwealth in the last several years around officer health, officer wellness, mental health, and resiliency, I just figured, for my last several years on the job, this would enhance my skill set as a cop, but also it'll set me up to if I choose to do some counseling practice after I retire, and the idea that I might be able to continue to serve my fellow officers and first responders and veterans, and keep them healthy, that it was appealing. So
great synergy.
We'll see how that goes.
Well, with everything that you're doing, obviously, I mean, the work that you're doing is important. Education is clearly very important. You love education, and I think it's important for the public to know too, because we have a chief who values education and wants to constantly learn, and wants his team of professionals to constantly be on that pathway to bettering themselves as well. With all that's going on, the work that you do is heavy at times. Who or what inspires you to keep you going when you feel down, or when you just feel like you've had enough? What is that it factor for you?
I can't point to any one person that inspires me. I try to read and listen to a variety of inspirational figures just to find new ways to stay on top of it. And I don't always do a great job. I wrote another recent blog post when I just had a recent episode. I was like, that's it, I'm done. I can't take it anymore. I got through it largely because of my studies. But, I just try to find good practices to engage in for self-care, stay up with my jiu-jitsu, get outside, schedule those date nights with my lovely bride. Yes,
I wasn't going to mention it, but you are public with those date nights. You really give us the whole script and tell us how it, from what you ate.
So we've been doing that. We've been doing date nights since we started dating. We just our schedules are so busy. We realized if we didn't program it, we'd miss it. Yeah. And then because we're comparatively young, healthy, and no kids, when the pandemic hit and things started reopening, we talked about it briefly. It's like, we just need to show people you can get out of the house and go do some stuff, support some local restaurants. So that's when we decided to start posting them.
I love your date night posts. They're so sweet. They're nice. All right, Chief. And if you had to choose one word to describe you, what would that word be?
Complicated.
Okay. Okay, we can stay with complicated. I think that your story is fascinating, and it's important for people, especially when you see those in law enforcement. There's always a backstory. There's a backstory to all of us, and so I just want to thank the chief today for taking the time to come on the show and tell us a little bit about young Mike.
So I'm going to get to return the favor. So
that is correct. That is correct. So I will be I'll be in the hot seat. But everyone, you've been listening to Backstory. Let's hear it on WTBR-FM Pittsfield with Roberta McCulloch Dews off the mayor's office in the city of Pittsfield. Thanks everyone for listening, and have a great day.